pivot or preserve meeting. The decision to pivot requires a clear eyed and objective mindset. We've discussed the telltale, telltale sign of the need to pivot, the decreasing effectiveness of product experiment, and the general feeling that product development should be more productive. Wherever you see those symptoms, consider a pivot. The decision to pivot is emotionally charged for any startup and has to address in a structured way. One way to mitigate this challenge is to schedule the meeting in advance. I recommended that every startup have a regular pivot or preserve meeting. In my experience, less than a few weeks between meeting is too often and more than a few months is too infrequent. However, each startup needs to find its own pace. Each pivot or preserve meeting requires the participation of both the product development and business leadership teams at IMBUs. We all added the perspective of outside advisor who could help us see past our preconception and interpret data in new ways. The product development team must bring a complete report of the result of its product optimization efforts over time, not just the past period, as well as a comparison of how those results stack up against expectation again over time. The business leadership should bring detailed account of their conversation with current and potential customer. Let's take a look at this process in action in a dramatic pivot done by a company called Wealthfront. That company was founded in 2007 by Dan Carroll and added Andy Rachlev as CEO shortly thereafter. Andy is a well known figure in Silicon Valley. He is a co founder and former general partner of the venture capital firm Benchmark Capital and is one of the faculty of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where he teaches a variety of courses on technology entrepreneurship. I first met Andy when he commissioned a case study on IMBUs to teach his students about the process we had used to build the company. Wealthfront mission is to disrupt the mutual fund industry by bringing greater transparency, access, and value to retail investor. What makes Wealthfront story unusual, however, is not where it is today, but how it begins as an online game. In Wealthfront original incarnation, it was called Kaching and was conceived as a kind of fantasy league for amateur investor. It allowed anyone to open a virtual trading account and build a portfolio that was based on real market data without having to invest real money. The idea was to identify diamonds in the rough, amateur traders who lacked the resources to become fund manager but who possess market insight. Wealthfront founders did not want to be in the online gaming business per Kachung was part of the sophisticated strategy in the service of their larger vision. Any student of disruptive innovation would have looked on approvingly. They were following that system perfectly by initially serving customers who were unable to participate in the mainstream market. Over time, they believed the product would become more and more sophisticated, eventually allowing users to serve and disrupt existing professional fund manager. To identify the best amateur trading seventh Wealthfront builds sophisticated technology to read the skills of each fund manager, using techniques employed by the most sophisticated evaluators of money manager, the premier US university, and endowment. Those methods allow them to evaluate not just the return the manager generated, but also the amount of risk they had taken, along with how consistent they performed relative to their declared investment strategy. This fund manager who achieve great return through reckless gambles, that is, investment outside their area of expertise, would be ranked lower than those who had figured out how to beat the market through skill. With its catching game, Wealthfront hoped to test two. leap of faith assumption. Number one, a significant percentage of the game player would demonstrate enough talent as virtual fund manager to prove themselves suitable to become manager for of real assets, the value hypothesis. Number two, the game would grow using the viral engine of growth and generate value using a freemium business model. The game was free to play, but the team hoped that a percentage of the player would realize that they were Lucy trader and therefore want to convert to playing customer once Valfram started offering real asset management service. The growth hypothesis catching was a huge early success, attracting more than four, 400 450,000 gamers in its initial launch. By now, you should be suspicious of this kind of vanity metrics. Many less disciplined companies would have celebrated that success and felt their future was secure, but Wellfrom had identified the assumption clearly. He was able to think more rigorously. By the time Wellfront was ready to launch its paid financial product, only seven amateur managers had qualified as worthy of managing other people's money far less than the ideal model had anticipated. After the paid product launch, they were able to measure the conversion rate of gamers into conversion rate was close to zero. Their model had predicted that hundreds of customers would sign up, but only 14 did. The team worked voluntarily to find ways to improve the product, but none showed any particular promise. It was time for a pivot or preserve meeting. If the data we have discussed so far was all that was available at that critical meeting, Wealthfront would have been in trouble. They would have known that their current strategy wasn't working, but not what to do to fix it. That is why it was critical that they followed the recommendation earlier in this chapter to investigate alternative possibility. In this case, Wealthfront had pursued two important lines of inquiry. The first was a series of conversation with professional money manager, beginning with John Power, the head of Stanford University Endowment, who reacts surprisingly positive. Wealthfront strategy was premised on the assumption that the professional money manager would be reluctant to join the system because the increased transparency would threaten their sense of authority. Power had no such concern. CEO Andy Ratcliffe then begins a series of conversations with other professional investment managers and brought the result back to the company. His side were as follow. Number one, successful professional money managers felt they had nothing to fear from transparency since they believe it would validate their skill. Number two, money managers faced significant challenges in managing and scaling their own business. They were hampered by the difficulty of servicing their own accounts and therefore had to require high minimum investment as a way to screen new clients. The second problem was so severe that Wealthfront was fielding cold call from professional managers asking out of the blue to join the platform. These were classic early adopters who had the vision to see past the current product to something they could use to achieve a competitive advantage. The second critical qualitative information came out of the conversation with consumer. It turned out that they found the blending of virtual and real portfolio management on the catching website confusing. Far from being a clear way of acquiring customer, the freemium strategy was getting in the way by promoting confusion about the company positioning. This data informed the pivot or preserve meeting. With everyone present, the team debate what to do with its future. The current strategy wasn't working, but many employees were nervous about abandoning the online game. After all, it was an important part of what they had signed on to build. They had invested significant time and energy building and supporting those customers. It was painful as it always is to realize that that energy had been wasted. Wealthfront decided it could not preserve as it existed. The company chose instead to celebrate what it had learned. If it had not launched its current product, the team never would have learned what it needed to know to pivot. In fact, the experience taught them something essential about their vision. As Andy say, what we really wanted to change was not who managed the money, but who has access to the best possible talent. We originally thought we need to build a significant business with amateur and manager to get professional to come on board. But fortunately, it turns out that wasn't necessary. The company pivot, abandoning the game customer altogether and focusing on providing a service that followed customer to invest with professional manager. On the surface, the pivot seems quite dramatic in that the company changed its positioning, its name, and its partner strategy. It even jet jettis- jettisoned a large proportion of the feature it had built, but at its core, a surprisingly amount stayed the same. The most valuable work the company had was building technology to evaluate manager effectiveness, and this became the kernel around which the new business was built. This is also common with pivots. It is not necessary to throw out everything that came before and start over. Instead, it's about repurposing what has been built and that has been learned to find a more positive direction. Today, Wealthfront is prospering as a result of its pivot, with over $180 million invested on the platform and more than 40 professional manager. It recently was named one of the Fast Company 10 most innovative companies in finance. The company continues to operate with agility, scaling in line with the growth principles outlined in Chapter 12. Wealthfront is also a leading advocate of the development technique known as continuous deployment, which we'll discuss in Chapter 9. Failure to pivot. The decision to pivot is so difficult that many companies fail to make it. I wish I could say that every time I was confronted with the need to pivot, I handle it well. But this is far from true. I remember one failure to pivot especially well. A few years after IMVU's founding, the company was having tremendous success. The business had grown to over $1 million per month in revenue. We had created more than 20 million avatar for our customers. We managed to raise significant new rounds of financing, and like the global economy, we were riding high, but danger lurked around the corner. Unknowingly, we had fallen into a classic startup trap. We had been so successful with our early efforts that we were ignoring the principle behind them. As a result, we missed the need to pivot even it stared us in the face. We had built an organization that excelled at the kind of activities described in earlier chapter, creating minimum viable products to test new ideas and running experiment to tune the engine of growth. Before we had begun to enjoy success, many people had advised against our low quality, minimum viable product and experimental approach, urging us to slow down. They wanted us to do things right and focus on quality instead of speed. We ignored that advice mostly because we wanted to claim the advantage of speed after our approach was vindicated. The advice we received changed. Now most of the advice we heard was that you can't argue with success, urging us to stay the course. We liked this advice better, but it was equally wrong. Remember that the rationale for building low quality MVPs is that developing any feature beyond that early adopter require is a form of waste. However, the logic of this takes you only so far. Once you have found success with early adopter, you want to sell to mainstream customer. Mainstream customers have different requirements and are much more demanding. The kind of pivot we needed is called a customer segment pivot. In this pivot, the company realized that the product it's building solve a real problem for real customer, but that they are not the customer is originally planned to serve. In other words, the product hypothesis is confirmed only partially. This chapter describes such a pivot in the what is in story above. A customer segment pivot is an especially tricky pivot to execute because if as we learned the hard way at IM, we use the very actions that made us successful with early adopters were diametrically opposed to the actions we have to master to be successful with mainstream customer. We lack a clear understanding of how our engine of growth operated. We had begun to trust our vanity metrics. We had stopped using learning milestone to hold ourselves accountable. Instead, it was much more convenient to focus on the our larger growth metrics that were so exciting, breaking new records in signing up paying customer and active user, monitoring our customer retention rate. You name it. Under the surface it should have been clear that our efforts at tuning the engine were reaching diminishing return, the classic sign of the need to pivot. For example, we spend months trying to improve the product activation rate, the rate at which new customer become active consumer of the product, which remain stubbornly low. We did countless experiment, usability improvement, new persuasion technique, incentive program, customer quest, and other game-like features. Individually, many of these new feature and new marketing tools were successful. We measured them rigorously using A/B experimentation, but taking an aggregate over the course of many months, we were seeing negligible changes in the overall drivers of our engine of growth. Even our activation rate, which had been the center of our focus, edge up only a few percentage points. We ignored the sign because the company was still growing, delivering month after month of up and to the right result, but we were quickly exhausting our early adopter market. It was getting harder and harder to find customer we could acquire at the price we were accustomed to paying. As we drove our marketing team to find more customer, they were forced to reach out more to mainstream customer, but mainstream customers are less forgiving of an early product. The activation and monetization rates of new customers started to go down, driving up the cost of acquiring new customer. Pretty soon, our growth was flatlining, and our engine sputter and stall. It took us far too long to make the changes necessary to fix this situation. As with all pivot, we had to get back to basic and start the innovation accounting cycle over. It felt like the company's second founding. We had gotten really good at optimizing, tuning, and iterating, but in the process, we had lost sight of the purpose of those activities, testing a clear hypothesis in the service of the company vision. Instead, we were chasing growth, revenue, and profit wherever we could find them. We need to reacquaint ourselves with our new mainstream customers. Our interaction designer lead the way by developing a clear customer archetype that was based on extensive in person conversation and observation. Next, we needed to invest heavily in a major product overall design to make the product dramatically easier to use. Because of our over focus on fine tuning, we had stopped making large investments like these, preferring to invest in low risk and lower yield testing experiment. However, investing in quality design and larger projects did not require that we abandon our experimental roots. On the contrary, once we realized our mistake and executed the pivot, those skills serve us well. We created a sandbox for the experimentation, like one described in chapter 12, and had a cross functional team work exclusively on this major redesign. As they built, they continues tested their new design had to had against the old one. Initially, the new design performed worse than the old one, as is usually the case. It lacked the feature and functionality of the old design and had many new mistakes as well. But the team relentlessly improved the design until months later it performed better. This new design laid the foundation of our future growth. This foundation has paid off handsomely. By 2009, revenue had more than doubled to over 25 million annually, but we might have enjoyed that success earlier if we had pivoted sooner. A catalog of pivot. Pivot come in different flavor. The word pivot sometimes is used incorrectly as a synonym for change. A pivot is a special kind of change designed to test a new fundamental hypothesis about the product business model and engine to growth. Zoom in pivot. In this case, what previously was considered a single feature in pivot becomes the whole product. This is type of pivot what isn't made when it's pivot away from a full social network and towards a simple water contact product. Zoom out pivot. In the reverse situation, sometimes a single feature is insufficient to support a whole product. In this type of pivot, what was considered the whole product become a single feature of a much larger product. Customer segment pivot. In this pivot, the company realized that the product it is building solve a real problem for a real customer, but that they are not the type of customer it's originally planned to serve. In other words, the product hypothesis is partially confirmed, solving the right problem, but for a different customer than originally anticipated. Customer needs pivot. As a result of getting to know customer extremely well, it sometimes becomes clear that the problem we are trying to solve for them is not very important. However, because of this customer intimacy, we often discover other related problems that are important and can be solved by our team. In many cases, these related problems may require little more than reposition repositioning the existing product. In other cases, it may require a completely new product. Again, this is a case where the product hypothesis is partially confirmed. The target customer has a problem worth solving, just not the one that was originally anticipated. A famous example is the chain Potbelly Sandwich Shop, which today has over 200 stores. It began as we can antique store in 1977. The owner started to sell sandwiches as a way to boost their traffic to their store. Pretty soon, they had pivoted their way into an entirely different line of business. Platform pivot. A platform pivot refers to a change from one application to a platform or vice versa. Most commonly, startups that aspire to create a new platform begin life by selling a single application, the so-called killer app for their platform. Only later does the platform emerge as a vehicle for third parties to leverage as a way to create their own related product. However, this order is not always set in stone, and some companies have to execute this pivot multiple times. Business architecture pivot. This pivot borrows a concept from Geoffrey Moore, who observed that companies generally follow one of two major business architecture: high margin, low volume, complex system model, or low margin, high volume operation model. The former commonly is associated with business to business B2B or enterprises sales cycle, and the later with consumer product. There are notably exception in a business architecture pivot. A startup switch architecture. Some companies change from high margin, low volume by going mass market. For example, Google search appliance, other originally designed for the mass market, turn out to record long and expensive sales cycle.